This story delves into the complexities of judgment bias and the human connections that transcend political symbols. It follows Rachel, a dedicated case manager at Hope Shelter, who, in her commitment to helping those in need, confronts her own biases when a guest wearing a MAGA hat seeks assistance. Unbeknownst to Rachel, this guest, John Hargrove, is a significant donor whose contributions have been instrumental in funding the shelter's programs. The chill of winter had settled into the heart of the city, and the wind howled through the narrow streets as it carried the biting cold. The sidewalks were slick with ice, the evening sun hidden behind clouds that had long since darkened the sky. People wrapped themselves in coats and scarves, hurrying to and from their destinations, trying to get home before the storm fully set in. In the heart of the city, nestled between aging buildings and tucked out of view from the main streets, was the Hope Shelter and Emergency Shelter that had served the homeless population for over a decade. Hope Shelter had a reputation for providing safe refuge for those in need, a warm meal, a place to sleep, and, above all, dignity. The staff prided themselves on treating everyone who walked through the doors with respect. It was a place where political differences, social standing, and personal beliefs were meant to be set aside. The shelter was a sanctuary, a place where the main focus was helping people rebuild their lives. Rachel, a young woman in her mid-20s, had been working at Hope Shelter for nearly a year. As a case manager, she was responsible for assisting guests with finding housing, securing resources, and guiding them through the difficult path of recovery. Rachel was passionate about her job. She was idealistic, believing wholeheartedly in the mission of the shelter. Every day, she arrived with the intent to do good, to make a difference in the lives of the people who came to the shelter. However, Rachel was also deeply influenced by her own political views that often felt at odds with the people she encountered at the shelter. Rachel had always prided herself on being progressive and vocal about her beliefs. She was an advocate for social justice, equality, and progressive change. She often found herself in heated debates about politics, believing that people should fight for the rights of others and challenge systems of oppression. Yet, at the same time, Rachel was learning the complexities of her work. She had seen people, her clients, who didn't share her beliefs, and it was sometimes difficult to separate personal values from professional responsibility. She often wondered how to reconcile her political views with the real world issues she faced daily in the shelter. On this cold evening, a few hours before closing, John Hargrove, a middle-aged man, arrived at Hope Shelter. He stepped in out of the cold, his red MAGA hat stark against the muted grays of the winter night. The shelter's front door opened with a slight squeak, and John made his way to the reception desk. Rachel was behind the desk, sorting through intake paperwork when she looked up and saw him. The redhead caught her attention immediately, her gaze flicking to it with a brief moment of judgment. In the few seconds it took for him to approach, Rachel's mind began to race. The MAGA had a symbol of a political movement that had become synonymous with divisiveness instantly triggered a reaction in her. She had seen the hat before, heard the debates, felt the anger that surrounded it. She had witnessed the harm it represented in the public sphere. And now, standing in front of her, was a person wearing it. John smiled warmly, the kind of smile that softened his weathered face, revealing a hint of vulnerability behind his otherwise tough exterior. "Good evening," he said with a slight rasp to his voice, as if the cold air had taken its toll. "I was hoping to get a place for the night. It's really cold out there." Rachel hesitated for a split second, her hands still resting on the intake papers, and a small, unintentional frown appeared on her face. Her mind flashed back to all the heated political conversations she'd had with friends, colleagues, and strangers alike, conversations that had fueled her belief in progressive politics. Now, standing before her was someone who likely didn't share her views, possibly someone whose beliefs she found offensive. The very presence of the MAGA hat had her feeling uneasy, unsure of how to respond, even though she knew she needed to remain professional. "Can I see some ID?" she asked, trying to push aside her discomfort. John nodded, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a battered wallet. He handed her an ID, but as Rachel glanced at it, she noticed something that made her pause. This man wasn't just a guest. He was someone who could be an important part of the community. "I've been coming through this area for a while," John continued, "but tonight the cold hit me hard. I thought I'd try to get a spot here." Rachel stared at the ID for a moment longer. He had a legitimate need, but her thoughts quickly returned to his hat. That hat to her, it represented everything she was against. It represented a political ideology that often seemed to directly oppose the values of inclusion and equality she held dear. Without thinking, she spoke before she could stop herself. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have a policy about political symbols," Rachel said, trying to sound professional despite the quick judgment forming in her mind. "We can't allow them in the shelter. You'll need to leave the hat outside." John blinked, clearly surprised. He hesitated, and Rachel could see the confusion on his face. It wasn't the reaction she had anticipated. But it was too late to take the words back. The policy had been clear, after all, about how political symbols weren't welcome in the shelter. I don't think I can leave it behind," John said softly. But there was a hint of sadness in his voice now. "It's something that's important to me." Rachel, feeling more certain in her decision, pressed on. "I understand, but I'm afraid it's our policy. Without compliance, I can't allow you to stay." She paused, watching his face as he processed her words. The silence in the room hung heavy. The other guests in the shelter, most of whom were sitting quietly, had already heard the exchange, and Rachel could sense that the situation was starting to draw attention. Some guests had started to glance over, eyes darting from her to John, waiting to see how this would unfold. John stood there for a moment, his gaze fixed on her. He didn't raise his voice, but there was a look of quiet disappointment in his eyes. "Fine," he said quietly, taking a step back. "I'll find somewhere else." With that, he turned and left the shelter, the door closing softly behind him. Rachel stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She had stuck to the rules, hadn't she? But as the door shut, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. She turned to the other staff members, but none of them had spoken up. The room fell silent again, as if the rejection of John had created an unspoken divide between the staff and the guests. Rachel wasn't sure whether it was guilt or unease that clung to her, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that this decision might have been wrong. She pushed the thoughts aside as best as she could. He had been an MAGA supporter, someone who might have challenged everything she stood for. And yet, part of her began to wonder, had she judged him too quickly? Did his hat truly define him? Or had she allowed her personal biases to cloud her judgment? As Rachel turned to clean up the intake paperwork, she caught sight of a flyer on the bulletin board by the door. It was for the upcoming fundraiser for Hope Shelter, an event aimed at raising money for their programs. The words on the flyer caught her attention. "Thanks to our generous donors, including Mr. John Hargrove, we are able to continue our work providing resources for those in need." Her stomach dropped. The name on the flyer was unmistakable. John Hargrove, the man she had just turned away. He wasn't just any guest. He was one of the shelter's largest benefactors. And Rachel had sent him away without even knowing who he was. The next morning, Rachel felt a deep sense of shame. She had spent the night replaying the events over and over in her mind, each moment more painful than the last. She knew that she had failed, but she also knew that it wasn't just about making a mistake. It was about the deeper issue of judgment and bias, something that she had yet to fully confront. As a case manager at Hope Shelter, Rachel was there to offer help and compassion. But last night, she had let her own preconceived ideas cloud her judgment. And in doing so, she had rejected a person who didn't deserve to be turned away. As she sat at her desk that morning, Rachel found herself distracted, her thoughts drifting back to John Hargrove. She had thought she knew what he stood for based on the hat he wore. But now she realized how little she truly knew about him. He could have been someone who had struggled with addiction, someone who had fallen on hard times. Or maybe he was simply someone who had wanted a warm bed for the night, just like many of the other guests who came through the shelter doors. But instead, she had let her assumptions take the lead. The shelter was busy as usual, staff running around preparing meals, assisting guests with paperwork, and providing resources. The energy was high, as it always was during the day shift. But Rachel could hardly focus. She hadn't seen John Hargrove since last night. She didn't know where he had gone or whether he had found shelter elsewhere. All she knew was that she had turned away someone who didn't deserve it. Her guilt was interrupted when Karen, the shelter's director, called her into her office. "Rachel, can you come in for a moment?" Corinne's voice echoed through the open door. Rachel took a deep breath, knowing that she couldn't put this off any longer. She walked down the short hallway to Corinne's office and knocked gently before entering. Corinne was sitting at her desk, flipping through some paperwork, but when she saw Rachel, she set it aside and motioned for her to sit. "Have a seat," Corinne said with a smile that was both warm and professional. But Rachel could see the underlying seriousness in her eyes. She knew this conversation wouldn't be easy. "I just wanted to check in with you about last night," Corinne began, her voice calm. "About Mr. Hargrove." Rachel's heart sank. She had a feeling this conversation was coming. But hearing Corinne speak so directly about it only deepened the weight of her actions. "I know what you're thinking, Corinne," Rachel said quickly. Before Corinne could continue, "I made a mistake. I shouldn't have turned him away based on the hat. It wasn't my place to judge." Corinne looked at her with a mixture of understanding and professionalism. "I know, Rachel, and it's not easy to admit when we've made a mistake. But I also want you to understand why this is so important. We're here to help everyone who needs us, regardless of their political beliefs, the clothes they wear, or the symbols they carry." But what happened last night wasn't just about the hat. It was about making assumptions without really understanding them. "Person standing in front of you." Rachel nodded, the weight of Corinne's words sinking in. She had seen so many people come through the doors of the shelter, each with their own stories, their own struggles, but she had failed to extend the same understanding to John Hargrove. Instead, she had let her personal biases dictate her actions. "I get it, Corinne," Rachel said, her voice quiet. "But I don't even know who he was. I just saw the hat, and I assumed." Corinne held up a hand to stop her. "I know, Rachel, but that's the issue. We all have biases, whether we want to admit it or not, and we have to fight against them. But the bigger issue here is who Mr. Hargrove is. Do you realize who he is?" Rachel looked up, confused. "Who is he?" Corinne leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in front of her. "Mr. Hargrove is one of our largest donors. He's the one who funded the expansion of this building, who helped pay for the meals we serve every day. He's been supporting this shelter and many others in the area for years. Without people like him, we wouldn't be able to provide the services we do." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea. How could she not have known? She had turned away one of the shelter's most important supporters, someone whose generosity allowed them to do the work they did. Rachel felt the sting of her mistake more sharply now. She had judged someone without knowing anything about them, and the consequences of that judgment were more severe than she had realized. "I didn't know, Corinne," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know he was one of our donors. I never would have. I mean, if I had known, I would have never." "I know you didn't know, Rachel," Corinne said softly. "But that's why we have to be so careful. We can't afford to make assumptions based on appearances or symbols. We have to see the person for who they really are. And Mr. Hargrove deserves our respect, no matter what his hat says. The next time someone walks through that door, we need to treat them as an individual, not based on the politics they might represent or the labels we've put on them." Rachel nodded, feeling the weight of Corinne's words. This wasn't just about John Hargrove. It was about how they treated every guest who came through the doors, no matter where they came from or what they believed. Rachel had made a mistake, but it was a mistake that could teach her a valuable lesson if she let it. "I'll go find him," Rachel said, standing up. "I'll apologize to him. He deserves to know that it wasn't personal." Corinne smiled, her tone encouraging. "I think that would be a good place to start, Rachel. You've taken the first step by acknowledging the mistake. Now, you just need to make it right." Rachel spent the rest of the morning searching the streets near the shelter, asking around at nearby coffee shops and public areas. She didn't know where John Hargrove had gone, but she couldn't stop thinking about the disappointment in his eyes. When she had turned him away, she had to make it right. The shelter's mission depended on empathy, understanding, and the ability to help those in need, regardless of political differences. And she had failed in that. After hours of searching, Rachel finally spotted John sitting alone on a park bench, a few blocks away from the shelter. He was still wearing the same MAGA hat, the brim pulled low over his eyes as he stared at the ground. Rachel took a deep breath and walked over to him. "Mr. Hargrove?" she said softly. John looked up in surprise, his eyes wary. "Yes, I'm Rachel," she said, sitting down beside him. "I'm the case manager at Hope Shelter. I just wanted to apologize for what happened last night. I judged you based on the hat you were wearing, and I'm deeply sorry for that. I didn't know who you were, but that's no excuse. I should have treated you with respect." John's expression softened, and he looked at her for a long moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but calm. "I understand. People often judge me because of that hat. But it's not who I am. It's just a symbol. I'm just like everyone else. I was just looking for a place to stay." "I know," Rachel said, her voice steady. "And I failed to see that. I'm truly sorry. You've done so much to support the shelter, and I should have been grateful for that. Instead, I made an assumption, and I turned you away." John nodded slowly, and for the first time, Rachel saw a glimpse of understanding in his eyes. "It's all right. It's not the first time something like this has happened. But I appreciate you coming to find me. That's not something I take lightly." Rachel smiled, relieved that he wasn't angry. "Thank you for understanding. I promise I'll do better. I'll make sure that we don't judge anyone based on a hat or a symbol. We're here to help people, not to turn them away." The following day, Rachel woke up with a heavy heart. She had gone through the motions of the day before, sorting through case files, answering calls, and meeting with other staff members. But she knew that yesterday had been pivotal not just for the shelter, but for her. The realization that she had turned away someone who had been so instrumental to their mission felt like an overwhelming weight on her shoulders. As a case manager, Rachel's job was to serve the guests with the utmost respect, to make sure they had everything they needed to get back on their feet. But last night, she had failed to live up to that responsibility. She had allowed her personal political views to overshadow her professionalism. And now, the consequences of her actions were coming into sharper focus. John Hargrove had been someone who had provided for the very shelter that Rachel worked at, funding the programs that provided shelter, food, and resources for the community. Yet, because of her snap judgment about his MAGA hat, she had turned him away at the door without ever learning who he really was. Rachel couldn't stop replaying his face when he left, the confusion, the hurt. He had asked for help, and she had dismissed him. But that morning, after her conversation with Karen, Rachel knew she had to take responsibility. She had already promised Karen that she would make it right. And now it was time to fulfill that promise. Rachel decided she couldn't wait any longer. She had to find John, apologize to him, and own her mistake. He deserved that much, at the very least. But as she prepared to leave the shelter for another round of searching, a phone call came in. It was Karen. "Hi, Rachel. I just wanted to give you a heads up." Karen's voice crackled through the phone. "John Hargrove called the shelter this morning." Rachel's heart sank. She hadn't expected him to reach out. And now the fear of facing him over the phone sent a wave of anxiety through her. "What did he say?" Rachel asked, trying to steady her voice. Karen's tone was calm but firm. "He wanted to know why he was turned away. I explained that it was a misunderstanding on our part. I also told him that you were planning to apologize in person. He seems open to hearing from you directly, but Rachel..." Karen hesitated. "He was hurt. I think it's important you understand that. Not just because he's a donor, but because we let him down as a shelter that stands for compassion." Rachel swallowed hard. She had feared that John would be upset, but hearing it from Karen made it real. "I understand," Rachel said quietly. "I'll go find him. I'm so sorry." Karen's voice softened. "You don't need to apologize to me, Rachel. Just take responsibility and make sure it doesn't happen again. That's the best you can do." Rachel set out for the streets, the weight of Karen's words still heavy in her mind. As she walked through the city, she reflected on the difference between what she had thought was right and the reality of what she had done. It wasn't just about making the right apology. It was about confronting her own biases and understanding that her actions had consequences beyond what she had initially considered. After a few hours of walking, Rachel finally spotted John Hargrove again. He was sitting alone at a coffee shop, quietly sipping from a cup as he stared out the window. The sight of him made Rachel's heart ache. He didn't look like the angry, vengeful person she had feared he might be. Instead, he seemed lost in thought, his face calm but distant. Rachel hesitated for a moment, watching him. Was this the right time to approach him? Would he be open to hearing what she had to say? Taking a deep breath, she walked toward the table where John sat, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached, he looked up and saw her standing there, a mix of recognition and uncertainty crossing his face. "Mr. Hargrove," Rachel said, her voice shaky but sincere. John looked at her for a long moment, as though considering whether to speak. Finally, he nodded, setting his coffee cup down on the table. "Rachel, right?" he said softly. "Yes," she replied, sitting down across from him. She paused, unsure of how to begin. I wanted to apologize for what happened at the shelter last night." John's face didn't change, but Rachel could see a flicker of emotion in his eyes. He didn't interrupt her as she continued. "I made a huge mistake," Rachel said, her voice steadying as she spoke. "I judged you based on something I shouldn't have your hat. I assumed you were someone I didn't want to associate with, and because of that, I denied you the help you needed. I am so sorry." John didn't speak at first, and Rachel began to wonder if she had said enough. But then he nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You didn't know who I was," he said, his voice calm. "And I understand that. People often judge me based on that hat, and I'm used to it. But that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt." Rachel looked at him, her eyes filled with remorse. "I didn't just judge you based on the hat," she said softly. "I judged everything about you without even knowing you. I'm so sorry for that. You didn't deserve that." John studied her for a moment before leaning back in his chair. "I've been dealing with people making assumptions about me for a long time," he said, his voice heavy with experience. "People see the hat and immediately think they know everything about me. They think they know what I stand for, what I believe in. But the truth is, I'm just a person just like anyone else. I've been trying to help people my whole life, and I've given a lot to the shelter. I've supported it because I believe in what you do." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea, in her rush to judge him, she had failed to see that he was the very person who had helped make the shelter possible. She had turned away someone who had been trying to give back to the community, someone who genuinely cared about others. "I know," Rachel said quietly, tears threatening to well up in her eyes. "I didn't realize who you were. I'm so sorry for everything. I've let my own biases cloud my judgment, and I shouldn't have." John reached across the table, placing a hand on hers. His touch was firm but reassuring. "It's all right," he said. "You admitted your mistake, and that's all anyone can ask for. We all have our biases, but it's how we confront them, how we choose to change, that matters." "I'm not mad at you, Rachel. I'm just disappointed that it took something like this for you to see that I'm not the enemy." Rachel nodded, a lump in her throat. "I'm going to do better," she said, her voice filled with determination. "Not just with you, but with everyone I encounter. I won't let assumptions dictate my actions again." John smiled, a small but genuine smile that made Rachel feel like she had taken the first step toward redemption. "I believe you," he said, "and I hope you'll pass that message on to others. You can make a real difference here at the shelter. But it starts with seeing people for who they really are, not for what we assume they are." Rachel took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. The apology had been difficult, but it had been necessary. And now, for the first time since the previous night, she felt like she could move forward, knowing that she had learned a valuable lesson. As Rachel left the coffee shop, she felt lighter, more at peace with herself. The weight of her mistake had been lifted, but the lesson would stay with her forever. She had made the effort to apologize, to own her actions, and to confront her biases head-on. As she walked back to the shelter, her mind began to turn toward the future. She couldn't undo the past, but she could control how she moved forward. She had already started to reflect on how she could make the shelter more inclusive, how she could ensure that her personal biases didn't interfere with her work. The apology to John had been a powerful step, but now it was time to work on changing the culture at the shelter. She was determined to lead by example, showing that true empathy meant seeing people for who they were beyond labels and symbols. And with that, Rachel knew she could begin to make real change, both within herself and within the community she was so deeply committed to serving. The weeks following Rachel's apology to John Hargrove were filled with a quiet sense of urgency. The sting of her mistake still lingered, but something had shifted inside her. The shelter's atmosphere seemed different now, not just in the way people interacted with the guests, but in the way they talked about inclusivity, judgment, and the importance of extending empathy to everyone. Rachel's eyes were open to the biases she had carried with her, and as much as it stung to confront them, it also created a sense of resolve. She had always been driven by the shelter's mission of helping those in need. But now Rachel was determined to do more. She realized that it wasn't enough to just meet the guests' immediate needs. There was a deeper work to be done. The shelter, like her, had to evolve, learn from its mistakes, and actively make space for inclusivity and compassion. Karen, the shelter's director, noticed the change in Rachel. She had always seen potential in her, but the shift was now undeniable. Rachel had come to terms with her error and, instead of allowing it to paralyze her, had used it as fuel for improvement. One day, after her morning shift, Karen called Rachel into her office. "Come in, Rachel," Karen said, her voice calm but filled with purpose. "I wanted to talk to you about something." Rachel, who had been feeling increasingly connected to the shelter's mission and staff, was curious but nervous. She had been working on a project aimed at addressing inclusivity, but she wasn't sure how it would be received by Karen. "Sure, Karen, what's on your mind?" Rachel asked, sitting across from her. Karen leaned forward in her chair, clasping her hands together on the desk. "I've been watching you over the past few weeks, and I have to say, I'm impressed with the work you've done. Not just with the guests, but with your reflection on the way we operate as a whole. You've really embraced the challenge of confronting your own biases, and I've noticed the positive impact it's had." Rachel flushed, feeling the weight of Karen's praise. She hadn't been seeking recognition, but hearing it from Karen made her feel like she was on the right path. "Thank you, Karen. I've realized that it's not enough to just work with the guests. I need to understand the bigger picture, too. We need to create a space where everyone, regardless of their beliefs or backgrounds, feels welcome." Karen smiled, nodding in agreement. "I've seen that change in you, and because of that, I wanted to ask you something. We're looking to create a more comprehensive program here, one that addresses inclusivity not only for our guests, but for our staff as well. I think you're the right person to help lead that initiative." Rachel's eyes widened in surprise. "You want me to take on a leadership role?" Karen leaned back, giving Rachel a warm smile. "Yes, Rachel, I've been thinking about this for a while. You have the passion, the insight, and the experience to make this work. I want you to lead a new diversity and inclusion initiative here at the shelter. This isn't just about improving how we interact with our guests. It's about examining our own biases, creating a space where everyone feels respected, and making sure we're truly providing the support our community deserves." Rachel's mind raced. The opportunity was huge, but it also came with a sense of responsibility that made her heart pound. She had just begun to confront her own biases. Now she was being asked to help guide others through that same process. "This is a big step, Karen," Rachel said, feeling a knot in her stomach. "I'm honored that you think of me, but I'm not sure I'm ready to lead something like this. What if I'm not able to make the changes we need?" Karen's gaze softened. "I understand your concerns, but that's exactly why I think you're the right person. You've made mistakes, Rachel, and you've learned it from them. That's the foundation for real growth. If you can guide others through their own process of learning and self-reflection, you'll have the power to create meaningful change. This is an opportunity to be vulnerable and honest, and I believe you can bring that authenticity to this role." Rachel's heart swelled with a mix of fear and excitement. She had always been the kind of person who cared deeply about helping others, but this felt different. She wasn't just helping individuals in crisis. Anymore, she was being asked to help reshape the entire culture of the shelter. "I'll do it," Rachel said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'll do my best to create a space where everyone feels valued and heard." Karen's eyes lit up. "I knew you'd say that. I'll work with you to make sure you have the support you need. But I think you'll be amazing at this." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning, organizing, and researching. Rachel dove headfirst into the task of developing the Diversity and Inclusion Program, meeting with various staff members to gather input and ideas. She wanted to create something that was not only practical but meaningful. It wasn't just about putting together a set of guidelines. It was about fostering a culture of respect, understanding, and empathy. She began by organizing workshops for the shelters, staff workshops that would focus on recognizing, unconscious biases, understanding the importance of inclusivity, and creating a more welcoming environment for both staff and guests. The workshops were interactive and centered around discussion, encouraging staff to share their experiences and thoughts on the challenges they faced when it came to working with people from different backgrounds. At first, there was resistance. Some staff members were hesitant to engage with the material, unsure of how it would affect their work. Others were uncomfortable talking about their own biases, unwilling to confront aspects of themselves that they had never had to face before. But Rachel didn't give up. She encouraged vulnerability and openness, creating a safe space where staff could learn and grow together. One afternoon, during one of the workshops, Rachel noticed a shift. A staff member named Lisa, who had previously been quiet and disengaged, raised her hand. "I've never really thought about it like this before," Lisa said, her voice tentative but thoughtful. "I always thought of myself as someone who didn't judge others. But now I see that I've been carrying assumptions without even realizing it. I didn't even know I had these biases. I guess I just assumed people came to the shelter because of things like laziness or bad choices. But maybe that's not the full story." Rachel smiled warmly at Lisa, grateful for her honesty. "Thank you for sharing that, Lisa. It's not easy to admit our own biases, but that's the first step toward real change. We're all on this journey together." The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of Lisa's words settled in. The staff began to share their own reflections, discussing their experiences with guests who didn't fit the stereotypes they had held. By the end of the session, the atmosphere in the room had shifted from skepticism to openness. There was a new sense of understanding, of willingness to confront the difficult realities of bias and judgment. For Rachel, it was a moment of triumph. She realized that this program wasn't just about helping others understand inclusivity. It was about creating a community of people who were willing to learn and grow together. And with each workshop, each conversation, the culture of the shelter was shifting. One evening, as Rachel was leaving work, she ran into John Hargrove again. He was standing outside the shelter, a familiar red MAGA hat still perched on his head. But this time, instead of feeling like the hat defined him, Rachel saw it as just one piece of who he was, a man who had worked to make a difference, who had supported the very place she now worked at. "Mr. Hargrove," Rachel called out, walking toward him. John looked up, a surprised but pleasant expression on his face. "Rachel, how's everything going?" Rachel smiled, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over her. "Things are going well. I wanted to thank you again for what you've done for the shelter. I've learned so much from you, not just about funding, but about the importance of seeing people for who they truly are." John nodded, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I appreciate that, Rachel. It's been a long road, but I'm glad to know that the shelter is in good hands. I've been working on a diversity and inclusion program for the shelter," Rachel said, her voice full of pride. "We've been talking about biases, stereotypes, and how to make sure everyone who comes through our doors feels valued." John's eyes softened with approval. "That's exactly what this place needs. I'm glad to hear it. You're doing important work here, Rachel." Rachel felt a sense of validation, knowing that her journey from her mistake with John to this moment of growth had led her to a place where she could truly make a difference. She had learned the importance of looking beyond the surface, of confronting her biases and embracing change. "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice sincere. "I hope we can continue to work together to make this shelter a place of understanding, compassion, and real change." John smiled and nodded. "I think you're already doing that, Rachel. Just keep going." As Rachel walked away from the shelter that evening, she felt a deep sense of purpose. She knew the work ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was worth every step. She had learned it the hard way, but now she was committed to building a better future, not just for the shelter's guests, but for the entire community. And with each step forward, she knew she was creating a ripple effect of change, one that would last far beyond her own actions. The days following Rachel's heartfelt apology to John Hargrove were filled with a profound sense of change. The shelter, once a place where judgments were made based on appearances, was now evolving into a sanctuary of understanding and compassion. Rachel had taken the first step toward transformation, but the journey was far from over. It was time to implement the lessons learned and ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Rachel knew that change required more than just good intentions. It demanded action. She began by organizing a series of workshops for the shelter staff, focusing on diversity, inclusion, and unconscious bias. The goal was to create an environment where every individual, regardless of their background or beliefs, felt valued and respected. The workshops were met with mixed reactions. Some staff members were eager to participate, recognizing the importance of the initiative. Others were skeptical, unsure of how these sessions would impact their daily interactions with guests. Rachel understood their apprehensions but remained steadfast in her commitment to fostering a more inclusive atmosphere. As the workshops progressed, Rachel noticed subtle shifts in the staff's attitudes. Conversations became more open, and there was a noticeable decrease in the judgmental remarks that had once been commonplace. The staff began to see the guests not as stereotypes, but as individuals with unique stories and struggles. The impact of the workshops extended beyond the staff. Guests at the shelter began to feel the change as well. There was a newfound sense of trust and openness. Individuals who had previously been hesitant to seek help now felt comfortable sharing their stories, knowing they would be met with empathy rather than judgment. One evening, as Rachel was overseeing the dinner service, she noticed a guest named Maria sitting alone, her head bowed. Maria had been a regular at the shelter for months, but she had always kept to herself, rarely engaging with others. Rachel approached her, offering a warm smile. "Mind if I join you?" Rachel asked, pulling up a chair. Maria looked up, surprised but appreciative. Of course, she replied softly. As they shared a meal, Maria opened up about her struggles, her battle with addiction, the loss of her job, and the estrangement from her family. Rachel listened intently, offering words of encouragement and support. This simple act of kindness was a testament to the transformation taking place within the shelter. Despite the positive changes, challenges remained. Not all staff members were fully on board with the new initiatives. Some resisted the changes, clinging to old habits and biases. Rachel encountered resistance from a senior staff member, Tom, who had been with the shelter for over a decade. "I don't see the point of all these workshops," Tom remarked one afternoon. "We've been doing this job for years without them. Why change now?" Rachel took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Tom, it's not about changing who we are. It's about understanding who the people we serve are. We have a responsibility to provide a safe and welcoming environment for everyone. That means confronting our biases and being open to change." Tom grumbled but didn't respond. Rachel knew that changing deeply ingrained attitudes would take time, but she was committed to the process. One afternoon, as Rachel was reviewing the shelter's donor records, she came across a familiar name, John Hargrove. She had known he was a significant donor, but she hadn't realized the extent of his contributions. John had not only funded the shelter's expansion, but had also established a scholarship fund for guests seeking to further their education and skills. Feeling a mix of gratitude and guilt, Rachel decided to reach out to John. She wanted to thank him for his generosity and to update him on the positive changes taking place at the shelter. She called the number listed in the records and was pleasantly surprised when John answered. "Hello, John, this is Rachel from Hope Shelter," she began. "I wanted to personally thank you for your incredible support. Your contributions have made a significant impact on our ability to serve the community." John's voice was warm and genuine. "I'm glad to hear that, Rachel. It's been a pleasure supporting the shelter. I believe in what you're doing." Rachel hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I also wanted to apologize for the way I treated you when you visited the shelter. I judged you based on your appearance, and I deeply regret that. I have since taken steps to address my biases and to foster a more inclusive environment here." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then John spoke, his tone understanding. "Rachel, I appreciate your honesty. We all have our biases. What's important is that you're taking responsibility and making changes. That's what matters." His words were a balm to Rachel's conscience. She felt a sense of relief, knowing that John had forgiven her and that their relationship could move forward on a foundation of mutual respect. As the weeks turned into months, the shelter continued to flourish. The staff remained committed to the principles of inclusivity and empathy. Guests felt more comfortable and supported, and the community began to take notice of the positive changes. Rachel reflected on her journey, the mistakes, the lessons learned, and the growth she had experienced. She knew that the work was ongoing and that there would always be challenges to face. But she was no longer the person who had turned away guests based on a hat. She was someone who had learned the value of seeing people for who they truly were, beyond labels and appearances. One evening, as Rachel stood outside the shelter, watching the sunset, she felt a sense of peace. The journey had been difficult, but it had led her to a place of understanding and compassion. She was ready to continue the work, knowing that each day was an opportunity to make a difference.